So, I'm assuming you're all familiar with the Donnie Brasco story, even if it's only from watching the film, and by extension, know that Joseph Pistone was not the only undercover FBI agent working to disrupt the Mafia. In his 1988 book Donnie Brasco, My Undercover Life in the Mafia, Pistone focuses in particular on agents who he worked with to ensnare Milwaukee's Balistreri family and Florida's Trafficante family. When Pistone discusses other undercover agents, he invariably refers to them by the names they used undercover. Best I can tell, this is meant as a courtesy to protect their identities. Even with the mob diminished, Pistone himself continues to live in hiding, unconvinced that the $500,000 hit on him has really been dropped. But it seems strange to me he would bother, when not only are the names of his fellow agents public record, but one of them has completely eschewed the secrecy Pistone himself lives by. The subject of this video is the man Pistone introduced to you as Tony Rossi, the agent he worked with in Florida up to the end of his own assignment. This is the loose basis of the character Richie Gazzo in the film. Rossi's real name is Edgar S. Robb, Ed for short, and after retiring from the FBI in 1990, he went into politics, serving as a state senator and later sheriff for Virginia's Albemarle County. From the few articles I've dug up, this later stage of his career was marked by milquetoast rhetoric and overzealous anti-terrorism preparations, before he moved on to a less exciting position on the Board of Zoning Appeals. At some point around the turn of the century, Robb told his story to a historical fiction author, who would turn it into the 2002 biography Friend of the Family, an undercover agent in the Mafia, under an original pen name, D. Lay Jacobs. Jacobs remains a mystery to me. The book and its dust jacket give little more than his gender, that he has written 4 fiction books prior, and a list of inspirations in the dedication. From my reading of the book, I could also deduce Jacobs was relatively old, because he consistently referred to Asian people as Orientals. Yeah. The transition to non-fiction seems to have been difficult for Jacobs, who never put out another book under that name. Right from the start, his descriptive imagery of the hoods Robb deals with in his undercover work come off as crude and cliched. At one point, recalling some comments made by Pistone's mob friend Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, he sinks as low as to convey his accent in a phonetic spelling. But the biggest problem with Jacobs' writing style is that he never steps back to let Ed Robb tell his own story. From the very beginning of this true crime subgenre, when Peter Moss cleaned up The Real Thing into the Valachi Papers, readers have gotten used to hearing the subject of mob biographies tell their stories in their own words. And this goes beyond autobiographies. Books like Nick Pileggi's Wise Guy and Moss's later book Underboss quote liberally from the interviews used to tell the exploits of the book's subject. Jacobs doesn't do that, and his misplaced confidence in his ability to tell the story, well, robs us of really getting to know Ed Robb. And then there's the poor research. Before we move on to the book's contents, I'll treat you to my top 5 mistakes in Friend of the Family, listed in order of appearance. Number 1. Chapter 4, page 23. The book asserts that there's a rule in the Mafia against families sharing in a criminal enterprise. This appears to be a gross misinterpretation of the finagling mob families go through to smooth out the details when it does happen. Number 2. Chapter 6, page 56. Everything this book says about Jerry Listener, the guy Frank Collada whacked in Las Vegas. Listener is basically used as a reference for Tony Rossi when he's introduced to his targets in Florida, and the book describes him as, quote, a button in the Pittsburgh family. which he was not. More importantly, the book says he'd been murdered a month before the meeting, which took place, best I can tell, late February 1979, so it was impossible to debunk the claim. In reality, Listener lived until October of that year. This mistake left me wondering if Rob's telling of the story was as unreliable as Jacob's writing. Number 3, Chapter 12, page 136. The following description. Quote, "Of the 5 New York families, Bonanno, Lucchese, Gambino, Colombo, and Genovese, the Bonanno tradition was the most violent. The family's roots extended back to the 1930s, to Albert Anastasia, Prohibition, and the original Murder Inc., reputed to be the first mob hitmen for hire." ChatGPT couldn't have put it better. Number 4, Chapter 17, page 219. The final word on Joseph Massino. After the FBI pulled Pistone and Rob's assignments, and those responsible for letting Donnie Brasco get close to getting Mater in the crosshairs, quote, "Joey Massino disappeared soon afterward, presumed murdered." Again, this book came out in 2002, so I can't even give partial credit for spelling Massino's name right. Number 5, Chapter 20, page 243. As Rob enters into a new undercover op to root out heroin smugglers, dubbed Pizza 2, Jacobs gives us some insight on where the Italian-born Zips running the operation come from. Quote, "In their homeland, the police often surpass the criminals for cruelty and corruption. The Sicilian crime families, such as the 'Ndrangheta in Calabria and the Camorra near Naples, ruled through ruthless force." This made the list less for Jacob's misunderstanding of organized crime in Italy, and more for his demonstrating why people think we Americans are bad at geography. And even as it becomes clear the particular drug traffickers Rob's looking for are with the 'Ndrangheta, Jacobs continues to refer to them as the Sicilian Mafia. Friend of the family doesn't spend too long on Ed Rob's early life before he takes a job at the FBI, and his first major outing described is as part of the response directed at the 1971 Washington, D.C. May Day protest against the Vietnam War. Jacobs paints the protest, aimed at shutting down the day-to-day proceedings of government, as practically a terrorist plot of the sinister New Left, leaving out that the subsequent crackdown and mass arrests were a PR disaster for then-President Nixon. Having read Pistone's Donnie Brasco Unfinished Business, and his defense of Gregory Scarpa's disgraced FBI handler Lynn DeVecchio, I'm not entirely surprised to see Rob exhibit a thin blue-lined mindset at the federal level, but Jacobs does a poor job making his case. In an attempt to make the Bureau appear embattled by the anti-war movement, he invokes the 1971 break-in at the FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, failing to mention this was what exposed J. Edgar Hoover's COINTELPRO program, a secret counterintelligence program aimed at supposed domestic enemies which was leveled against the civil rights movement. You know, that thing Don Capria desperately wants you to believe went after the IACRL. I get the impression that even by 2002 standards, D.L.A. Jacobs was not internet savvy, and it never occurred to him that someone who wanted to look up this outrageous act against America's finest could find out just how much more there was to the story. At the same time, we see Hoover, in his final years, relax his opposition to undercover operations, and send some agents to pose as longhairs to infiltrate the left. And Jacobs tries to build up some tension by saying some agents went too deep into their undercover roles and disappeared. It would be far more impactful if he could give us a case study. After Hoover dies, undercover operations are finally started against organized crime, and Rob volunteers to take part as the Bureau figures out how to play the game. His early efforts don't go very far up the target's chains of command, and he blames his FBI superiors for not making the most of his efforts. It's not until early 1979 that he gets his big break, when he's asked to join the Tampa-based Operation Coldwater, an investigation into a New York Mafia transplant Gambino associate and aspiring garbage collection extortionist Jimmy Aguafreda. Ed Robb reinvents himself as Tony Rossi, a gangster dressed for the part who doesn't take any crap, and goes into deep cover as he's introduced to Aguafreda and his motley crew. Operation Coldwater consumes about half of Friend of the Family's 322 pages. Unfortunately, it's not exactly what I'd call a page-turner. Despite Jacob's attempts to build up Aguafreda as a serious, ruthless mobster, his failure to make money on the illegal gambling operations he tasks Rossi with protecting, and miserable fumbling of his would-be garbage collection cartel make him a joke. None of the other mobsters trying to find their fortune in Florida stand out either. Eventually, Rob connects with fugitive Lucchese member Vincenzo Cerullo, who himself already has clearance from Florida's resident boss Santo Traficante Jr. to do what he wants in his territory, and, in a meeting Rob tapes, he becomes an associate of the Lucchese family under Cerullo's authority. In what has to be the most dubious usage of the B word I've ever seen, Jacobs asserts that the Cerullo connection makes Tony Rossi a boss of organized crime in the area. He establishes his own social club of sorts, the King's Court, which turns into both a replacement venue for Aguafreda's gambling and an FBI surveillance honeypot. The book treats us to Ed Robb playing the part as he tries to draw in bigger players, even reaching out to the retired Meyer Lansky and expanding his investigation into South Carolina. Unfortunately, he still doesn't make much progress getting through the Mafia's chain of command. There are also few close calls of possible exposure to liven things up. I'll be blunt. Friend of the Family's retelling of Coldwater, and by extension roughly the first 2/3 of the book, is a dud. And the return of some familiar characters does little to change that. Unless I think of a better idea during editing, the subtitle for this review will be something along the lines of a Donnie Brasco Spinoff, but that's just clickbait. Friend of the Family doesn't really try to ride the coattails of Pistone's book. He's not even mentioned until his op with the Bonanos is inserted into Coldwater to accelerate both of them. Friend of the Family tells us that the joining of Pistone, an up-and-comer in the Bonanno family, and Rob, a self-described boss of 2 Florida counties, brought about a potential clash of egos between the two undercovers that had to be preemptively diffused, but doesn't do a good job illustrating this. If anything, the book inadvertently reminded me of Pistone's relative modesty. Brasco's earlier attempts to ensnare Frank Balistreri ended when the undercover who made the connection, codename Tony Conte, was detected by the Milwaukee boss. And Friend of the Family tells us that when word got back to New York, Pistone was able to shrug it off because he was just that convincing. But Pistone says he never had to put himself through that test, because Balistreri was too fearful of repercussions for himself if he admitted he'd been duped. I suspect any resentment was purely on Rob's end. There's a throwaway line in the book talking about how he felt Pistone had it easy, because he could disengage from Coldwater when he flew back to New York, not acknowledging the problems Pistone had in his own 6-year stint undercover. Case in point, when Jacobs gets to Pistone's original contact in the Bonanos, Tony Mira, trying to get Pistone reassigned to him, he leaves out the part where Mira accused Brasco of not kicking up a share of a drug deal, a smear that could have gotten Pistone killed. For the most part, though, the latter days of Operation Coldwater as told in Friend of the Family, is just recycled stories from Donnie Brasco. Compared to Pistone's later book, Donnie Brasco Unfinished Business, Friend of the Family has almost nothing to say about Ed Robb's testimony. Instead, the focus is on Robb's readjustment to life as a civilian and subsequent return to work with the FBI. The book tells us Robb was starting to go off the rails as Tony Rossi, but has little to say about the process of returning to normal life other than that he pulled it off. Compare this to Pistone's books. Despite Robb's claims he was going through the same issues, Pistone talks as though the Donnie Brasco persona, inasmuch as it existed, was effectively compartmentalized and then discarded when no longer of use to him. The final quarter of the book focuses on Robb's infiltration of the, so-called Sicilian Mafia. Buoyed by the success of the Pizza Connection investigation, the FBI and DEA began picking up cases of drug trafficking Sicilian transplants the first case had left behind. In his last major case, Robb takes on the persona of Kurt Wolf, construction company owner turned up-and-coming narco, and works his way up the heroin distribution chain. This culminates in him making a trip to Italy, a country where this sort of undercover work he specializes in is apparently unheard of, to meet with 'Ndrangheta kingpin Rafael Fiumara. Pizza 2, or Operation Infamita, as the DC subsection Robb worked with was known, isn't the most tense story, but it's an original one, and with the bumbling wannabe wise guys of Coldwater replaced with competent, proficient heroin traffickers, the stakes were finally high enough for me to find Friend of the Family an engaging read. It's during this part of the story where we also see Jacobs make his only token effort to fix another flaw in his writing style I've alluded to earlier. Go back to Donnie Brasco, and consider Pistone's free contacts with the Bonanno family. Tony Mira is a rude, hot-headed knife enthusiast who, jealous of the success Brasco brought to Lefty Ruggiero, has no problem throwing out accusations that could get him killed as he tries to get the promising associate back. Ruggiero, Pistone's biggest mob mentor, is highly knowledgeable and does his best to look out for Donnie, but he's also a degenerate gambler and, on occasion, too inconsiderate for Pistone to handle. Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano, the man who would be boss, is even friendlier and doesn't feel the need to pull rank on Brasco the way Ruggiero does. The capo Sonny Black, letting Pistone spend the night in his apartment, has more gravity than Lefty Ruggiero doing so. On his Deep Cover podcasts, perhaps looking back through rose-tinted glasses, the usually unsympathetic Pistone offered perhaps his greatest compliment to Napolitano when he said they could have been friends if just one of them had had a different job. You see what I'm getting at? Donnie Brasco gives you a feel for all these people. Friend of the Family largely doesn't bother. Sure, Jacobs will tell you what the members of Tony Rossi's entourage were like, but he doesn't offer much in the way of examples of their behavior. No stories about their antics to liven things up. The best we get is during Pizza 2, where early drug connection Luigi Viciano, insecure about his undocumented status and in awe of his new boss, tries too hard to please Kurt Wolf. Otherwise, all of the criminal characters in this tale, especially in Operation Coldwater, come off as interchangeable goons. Friend of the Family ends with a one-paragraph summary of Ed Robb's post-FBI political career. In and of itself, that's not a problem. It's outside the scope of the book. The problem is, Jacobs never asks the all-important question, why? Why did Ed Robb and Joe Pistone take such different paths in life? But he gives us enough info to make an educated guess or two. First, Ed Robb spent less than half the time Pistone did in Deep Cover. and I have no reason to question his portrayal of the mobsters he dealt with as inconsequential bunglers. Pistone operated in the heart of the American Mafia, rather than the territory of a fading family that New York's dropouts moved to, and consequently the risk to his life was considerably higher. Put simply, Pistone's experience was truly unnerving, and would likely convince most people to shun the limelight, or at least find a way to take it on their own terms. At the end of Operation Coldwater, friend of the family shows Ed Robb weighing the benefits and drawbacks of additional security measures for himself and his family, and he considers that the Mafia wouldn't run the risk of the negative publicity and FBI crackdowns that would fall upon them if he or Pistone were harmed. Perhaps at some point it occurred to him seeking public office would make this obstacle even more insurmountable. Finally, Ed Robb simply comes off as bolder than Pistone, to the point of recklessness, I'd say. While Pistone tests the patience of his initial contacts in the Colombos with his reluctance to get involved in crimes, Robb causes a blow-up when, under the clock to infiltrate an illegal gambling operation under mob protection, he tells his wise guy point of contact he's actually looking to rob the game, and offers him a cut. Ed Robb constantly has his tape recorder running, when Pistone is very reluctant to use the bulky, awkward equipment the FBI makes available to him. The closest thing the book gives us to an explanation is simply that Ed Robb was feeling restless, citing in particular an incident where the Bureau declined to let him investigate a suspicious Teamsters VP he'd met by chance during Pizza 2. And for some reason, the Virginia Senate was the first thing that came to mind when it came to continuing a career in law enforcement. In any case, things turned out well enough. And I don't wanna